Well, assuming that you can't make it any cheaper. You put a tariff on it. You tax the British textile and make it more expensive than American textiles, and therefore most people will do a cost-benefit analysis. Same thing, I'll buy an American. The tariff will encourage more American consumers to buy your products. Now, if you live in Georgia, you don't produce textiles, you produce cotton for the textile industry. And you don't care who buys it as long as somebody buys it. The French, the British, Bostonians, they don't care who buys it. So you don't want a tariff. What a tariff would do was artificially make British textiles more expensive than American textiles, but the bottom line is the cost of living is going to go up. So Georgia's not going to pass a tariff. The Articles of Confederation gave each individual state the ability to regulate external commerce. So the problem is, we're all over the map when it comes to our economy. And the French and the British and the Dutch, they all have a field day laughing at us. They often ask us, now, when a business transaction was taking place, am I dealing with the United States or am I dealing with New York? You know, where are you guys on all this? Right? So it's very difficult, and it's very problematic for a big, diverse economy like ours to function when you've got 13 different chefs in the kitchen. Not too many cooks, right? Anyway, the last thing I want you to understand is it doesn't allow the federal government to issue ultimatums or decisions as it relates to disputes between the states. Let me give you a quick example. Where I'm from, in the state of Michigan, if you can imagine this, there was once upon a time a fight between Michigan and Ohio over the city of Toledo. You ever been to Toledo? The entire city smells like hot dog water. Right? Why anybody would want it is beyond me. Right? But nonetheless, we were going at it with Ohio over Toledo. Now, Ohio had been in the nation for longer than we had. And so they had more political power. So ultimately, they commissioned the federal government to grant them the city of Toledo. So we were really upset by that. And so what did we do? Take a look at the state of Michigan. Does it look a little bit strange to you? What's strange about it? Yeah, there's a lake between parts of the state. I mean, there's no other state in the country like it. Right? What we did, we turned around and we did to Wisconsin the same thing that Ohio had done to us. We said, this strip of land up here, we're taking it. Right? And because we had more political power than they did at the time, it stuck. Right? So anyway, that doesn't exist in 1777. So New York and New Jersey would go at it, and there would be no final decision as to who's in charge. They would go on and on and on forever. Right? I'm going to show you a video as it relates to the problems that the Articles of Confederation raised with respect to American politics. And as you watch it, I want you to be very mindful of Shays' Rebellion, Daniel Shays, and I want you to pay particular attention to the Northwest Ordinance. We'll come back and I'll tie it up together for us.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
I think too often we assume that the United States had always been united. From the period of the Declaration of Independence, if not earlier, we've been united in opposition to Britain, in opposition to the other enemies of the American Republic, that we'd always been united, but actually it's just the opposite.
Without the all-consuming mission of war to hold the country together, regional and ideological differences resurfaced. The Congress trying to govern under the Articles of Confederation was largely ineffectual.
The whole theory of Confederation is that the Congress would propose what the states ought to do, and I emphasize the ought. But Congress had no mechanism, actually no authority or mechanism to enforce its resolutions, its recommendations, its requisitions for supplies and for taxation. So there's a basic problem of enforcement under the Articles of Confederation. I mean, the states, I think, were trying as hard as they could, but they had problems of their own, and it came to be perceived that a union that relied always on the voluntary goodwill of the states could not really last very long or function very effectively.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice.
With 13 different political entities making laws, a whole new set of legal concerns began to proliferate. If all the states were sovereign, who had the authority to arbitrate in quarrels between the states? Conflicts over matters of trade, commerce, monetary policy, and borders were straining interstate allegiances.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility.
In the fall of 1786, a group of armed farmers marched on some of the county courthouses in western Massachusetts. Led by a former Army officer, Daniel Shays, they were protesting excessive taxes imposed by the state legislature.
Madison, who is often considered the father of the Constitution, was not only concerned about the weakness, what he called the imbecility of the Confederation, but he was concerned about the power of majorities in the state legislatures and the way in which they were creating injustice and creating problems within the states. And for him, Shays' Rebellion confirmed his feeling that if Massachusetts couldn't solve its problems, then what state could?
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense.
Despite the promise of being bound to one another to come to one another's aid, should attacks occur, in spite of the promise or pledging themselves to providing for the cost of this kind of defense through a common treasury, none of that was forthcoming when the Shays' Rebellion took place. In the end, Massachusetts pretty much had to raise the money on its own to put down the rebellion.
Providing for the common defense was not a minor concern in the United States in the 1780s. Ongoing conflict with Indian peoples on the frontier, combined with the continuing military presence of Britain and Spain on the continent, posed a constant threat to the security of the young nation.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare.
Perhaps the biggest threat to national security during this time was economic in nature. The 1780s was a time of financial turbulence.
Part of the Depression is due simply to demobilization, a lessening of demand for supplies and services as a result of the end of the War of Independence. But also the depression, the economic depression was due to actions taken by Great Britain, closing off, for example, much of the trade to the British West Indies, which had been important for the American colonies.
Many British merchants also refused to extend credit, making it virtually impossible for American merchants to conduct business overseas.
And one way of responding, obviously, would be that if Britain has restricted our access to certain markets, then we should retaliate. I mean, if they place duties on our goods, shouldn't we place duties on their goods?
But under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to establish a uniform trade policy. Therefore, any state could, and did, pursue its own self-interest at the expense of the other states.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity.
In the minds of the Founding Fathers, the way to secure the blessings of liberty for the future was to gain control over the Northwest Territory and develop procedures for settling those lands.
The Northwest Ordinance provided the means for establishing a way of governing the territories. Once you achieve the status of 60,000 inhabitants and apply for statehood and are admitted, you're a full participating member, equal to the original 13, which is important. So one major accomplishment is doing all of this in terms of political tutelage towards equality. The second is that the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery from those territories in the Old Northwest.
The Northwest Ordinance was one area in which Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, was able to be effective. Still, many leaders of the new nation agreed that the Articles were insufficient and needed to be revised. Among these, a smaller group including George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison believed that more drastic measures were necessary, and they began quietly to push for a reconceptualization of the entire federal government.
So let me, with the 6 or 7 minutes that we've got remaining here, try to make some sense for all of this for you. Did you catch who Daniel Shays was? He was a farmer, but in addition to being a farmer, he was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War. Right? Now, what the Continental Army had offered people like Shays before the war broke out was a bonus for enlisting, a bonus for their service. And so Shays was horribly disappointed when, after the war, the government said something to the effect of, funny story, we're broke and we don't have any ability to pay you. So, I mean, that was one thing. It was kind of an insult. But what added to this insult was the fact that a quote-unquote faraway government had the audacity to tax him. Now, where do you think he's talking about, this faraway government? Where would you presume he's referring to? Massachusetts, a faraway government? Is that what you mean? Well, yeah, and the Continental Congress is where? Exactly, right? You would assume it's in the nation's capital. As a matter of fact, Francisco's right, as long as you meant Boston, right? He was worried about this faraway government in Boston taxing him. Now, he's in the western part of Massachusetts. Has anybody been to Massachusetts? For those of you that come to, one person has, well, those of you that come to the Boston trip with us, you won't have to admit that. But if you throw a stone in any one direction, chances are it'll land outside of Massachusetts. So if this guy considers Boston a faraway government and he lives in western Massachusetts, can you imagine what he must think of New York or DC or someplace like that? Might as well be Mars for as far as he's concerned. So what Shays does, what comes to be known as Shays' Rebellion, is he gets together with another group of people that think like him. A lot of them happen to be veterans in their own right, and they go on this riot, right? Now, Massachusetts has a hard time putting down this unlawfulness. Now, if this were to break out in 2013, what would the president do? Exactly, he would mobilize the National Guards, right? Or like what you saw happen when there's a natural disaster or any kind of emergency at the local, state level at all, there are federal agencies as well as federal funds that are specifically designed to deal with these sorts of things. In other words, every once in a while, like with Shays' Rebellion, it kind of makes a lot of sense to have a strong, capable, centralized federal government. But because we were looking at this through the context of the American Revolution, we were opposed to this sort of thing. So for your notes, everybody, Shays' Rebellion is yet another glaring example as to why the Articles of Confederation are just inadequate. They sound great on paper. Unfortunately, societies don't play themselves out on paper. Daniel Shays didn't riot on paper. He rioted in Massachusetts. So it makes sense to have a stronger central government that can do things like send in the National Guards. Okay? That's what Washington did. Exactly. Any other questions? The last thing I want to talk about today is the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance is sort of the one thing that the Articles of Confederation actually did that empowered the federal government. The Northwest Ordinance, as the term suggests, refers to the Northwestern territories that were granted to us in the Treaty of Paris by Britain. In particular, think of the Great Lakes Basin region, right? Now, all of this land was was given away to us by the British after the war ended. Now, it's the federal government's power and discretion in terms of how to go about organizing. Translation, what will be legal out there, how you can apply for statehood, what the stipulations for statehood actually are. All of those things are the power of the federal government. Now, one thing that the government can do is sell that land. As far as everybody's concerned, it belongs to the federal government. Right? The Native Americans beg to differ, but that's another story. Anyway, what the government begins doing is selling land in the old Southwest very cheap, right? Like $1 an acre cheap. Now, they didn't nickel and dime. You had to buy like 500 acres at a time. But the bottom line was, if you could come up with that cash, the government was more than happy to fork over the land. So this policy of settling these land rights in the West is actually one way that the government can generate a little bit of cash. Now, even more importantly, the Northwest Ordinance is allowing the government to throw a little bit of its authority around. Okay? So, what would it be? And that's where I was going to go in just a minute. What the Northwest Ordinance says is if you want to become a state, you want to petition the federal government for statehood, you have to have at least 60,000 people. All right? So Ohio, before you can become Ohio, you have to have at least 60,000 people for your population. Yeah.
So basically statehood construction.
Exactly. And in addition to 60,000 people, write it down, you must formally outlaw slavery. Write it down. You cannot have slavery anywhere in the old Northwest Territory, right? So slavery is illegal in Wisconsin before there's even an idea for Wisconsin, okay? That's the stipulation. 60,000 people, no slavery. It's not a coincidence that this was named the Northwest Ordinance, and not just the Western Ordinance, right? Mississippi, Alabama, later on Louisiana, right? Slavery is more than fair game out there. We'll talk about why that is later in the semester. But for the moment, I want you to write down the date associated with the Northwest Ordinance. Now you know that I'm not a real big dates guy. Memorize these dates. 1784. It's a long, long, long time before 1857, right? Now, why am I making a big deal about this? Well, in 1784, it's Congress that issues this law. Write that down. Congress, the federal government, issues this law as it pertains to slavery. It's Congress saying slavery's okay here, but not okay here. And then several decades later, in 1820, it's going to be Congress that issues what comes to be known as the Missouri Compromise. Slavery's okay in Missouri. North of Missouri, not okay. Slavery's okay here, not okay there. Right? Later on, in 1850, slavery is not okay in California. It's Congress that is telling California that. Now, here's the issue. As the 19th century unfolds, there will be people that interpret the Constitution to mean the only entity in American life that can say where slavery is legal or not legal would be the state government. And ultimately what this is going to do is create this rift between not only the North and the South, but the various interpretations of the Constitution that would ultimately end in war in 1861. So I want you to understand, for a very, very, very long time, it had been Congress that had regulated the institution of slavery. Okay? And with that, we'll go ahead and end for today. Right? Have a very good weekend, everybody. And remember to participate in the discussion forum. See you later.